At dawn on a bitter February morning in 1943, a British corporal named Arthur Mendel scrawled in his field notebook, "We have no guns fit for these beasts, only buckets, barrels, and hope." His line, fragile yet defiant, stood as a question that runs beneath the entire history of improvised warfare. When power arrives in steel and tracks, what can human wit summon from scrap? The scene he described lay in the outskirts of Bizerte, Tunisia, a narrow street half buried under rubble where men of the Royal Engineers crouched behind overturned carts. Since the previous autumn, the German Afrika Korps had introduced more of its heavy Panzer VI Tiger tanks to the North African front, their 88mm guns piercing Allied armour almost at will. At roughly 57 tons each, the Tigers carried both myth and terror wherever they appeared. To the infantry caught in their path, every direct confrontation was suicide. Yet to the engineers, necessity has always been the mother of strange inventions. By lunch that same day, Mendel and his small team had filled tin buckets with concrete, dropped old nails and scrap iron into the mixture, and welded hooks along their sides. These crude cylinders were linked with wire and hidden beneath soft sand near a bottleneck of masonry. From a high window across the street, Lieutenant David Harrow, a former civil engineer apprentice from Leeds, watched quietly, sketching as they worked. "They look like children's toys," he murmured to his diary that evening. "But if luck sides with us, each toy may stop a tiger." Those makeshift blocks would later be remembered by troops with a mix of amusement and awe. Some called them hedgehogs for their spines of rebar, others, more cynically, dubbed them dumb buckets, a soldier's dry humour to mask desperation. The principle, though simple, reflected a long lineage of improvised obstacles, objects so ordinary they confounded the most advanced machines of war. Behind the modest nickname lay a truth about the Allied struggle in 1942–1944. Victory was not always crafted in factories. The first months of 1943 had pressed the Allies to desperation. The industrial preponderance of Britain and the United States was still crossing oceans, delayed by submarine warfare and bureaucratic fog. In the desert, and later in bomb-scarred towns across Italy and France, engineers were urged to fight not only the enemy, but scarcity itself. Orders to local commands at the time explicitly encouraged field expedients. Any obstacle or decoy that required no precious steel or standard equipment. It was, as one post-war historian would note, a laboratory of invention conducted under artillery fire. The central problem was scale. German heavy tanks dominated open ground. Anti-tank guns could do their work only with stable footing, clear range, and a steady crew. But in alleys, among rubble and twisted tram lines, those guns were too big, their angles useless. So the task fell to small teams of sappers and combat engineers like Harrow's to slow the behemoths long enough for infantry and portable explosives to finish what conventional armaments could not. By early spring, instructions for bucket barricades circulated informally between units in Tunisia, Sicily, and finally the Italian peninsula. No manual ever sanctioned them officially, though a War Office bulletin of May 1943 mentioned cement obstacles of local construction proving serviceable against heavy track vehicles. The idea was brutal and practical: embed concrete drums or tanks, fill them with stones or scrap metal, connect them into patterns that forced a tank's treads to climb, crack, or slip. They worked best at city junctions where the enemy could not maneuver freely. One of their clearest early deployments occurred during the fierce street fighting of Ortona in December 1943. Canadian units trapped in a maze-like Italian coastal town faced German positions supported by at least a dozen Tigers from the 1st Panzer Division. Remembering older Tunisian experiments, engineers from the loyal Edmonton Regiment scavenged oil drums, rubble, and even church bells fractured by bombardment, pouring quick-setting concrete into their shells. Each drum weighed almost 300 kilograms once filled. Civilians hiding in basements offered broken carts to haul them into place after dark. "We worked until our fingers bled white," one unnamed sapper recalled afterward. "Every corner we paved became a promise, the tanks shall crawl." These early drum hedgehogs often brought hours, sometimes days, of resistance. The barrels and slabs did not always destroy a tiger, they could not pierce its armor, but they exploited the law of physics where firepower failed. A multi-ton tank meeting a field of solid, irregular obstacles risked jamming its tracks or exposing its flanks. That small pause allowed commandos to slip near and plant magnetic mines or call for artillery aim. Witnesses in post-battle interviews noted that several heavy vehicles in Ortona became stuck like stranded whales, their crews forced to retreat or abandon them. Back in Britain, reports of these unusual victories circulated quietly. A military newsletter quoted one sergeant praising the humour in hopelessness, marvelling how rubbish had outwitted our finest enemy. Engineers from Portsmouth's Instructional Corps began small-scale tests, duplicating the Italian versions on training grounds. By early 1944, the design diversified. Some drums concealed anti-tank mines inside, others were made entirely of sandbags hardened by seawater, forming a crust thick enough to mimic concrete without draining scarce materials. It was near Anzio in February 1944 that the improvisation reached full expression. Under heavy fog, Allied sappers laid what official documents later labelled simply as drum obstacles along the coastal roads. "Here we meet again, Lieutenant Harrow, recently promoted and now commanding a section responsible for rear area fortifications." Contemporary letters show a mind both cautious and curious. "Nothing looks soldierly about a row of barrels," he wrote to his sister on February 16th, "but if the tanks halt and our men breathe longer, I'll gladly command a circus of dust bins." That circus proved effective. During the night of February 2021, elements of the German 26th Panzer Division probed the Allied flanks, encountering a series of narrow lanes crisscrossed with wire, and those very obstacles. One Tiger rolled forward, then buckled its sprocket wheel when the edge of a filled drum wedged beneath. In the seconds of confusion that followed, 5 bazooka teams struck. The after-action records list 3 tanks disabled that night, likely through this chain of luck and design. Official dispatches acknowledged the result, but not the device's humble anatomy. The line read only, "Enemy armor checked by local obstacles, countermeasures successful." Looking beyond battlefield increments, the dumb bucket reflected a deeper ethos taking shape within Allied ranks. Warfare had reached an industrial scale, yet its resolution often depended upon instincts older than machines, creativity, dexterity, and the will to adapt. To watch engineers repurpose tins, horseshoes, and water pipes into defenses was to glimpse a strange symmetry between destruction and rebuilding. After each bombardment, the same rubble that symbolized ruin became raw material for the next stand. For the men behind these obstacles, the struggle was more intimate than doctrine implies. Each drum poured meant hours of labor under sniper eyes, with cement dust clinging to sweat. Each successful blockade carried the weight of exhaustion and of lives spared. Civilians, especially in urban zones of Italy and later Normandy, joined in, providing buckets, gravel, or simply standing watch. Their quiet contribution blurred the line between soldier and survivor. In the diary of an Italian schoolteacher from Cassino, paraphrased from the original, a single sentence captures their shared anxiety. "We built walls for those who would fight and prayed that none would need to die behind them." As the war moved north, spreading through France in 1944, the field expedients multiplied. French resistance groups adapted similar methods using oil drums and cement, thanks to information passed through Allied liaison officers. German documents recovered after the liberation of Paris mention primitive yet troublesome street obstacles consisting of filled drums and rails. Even the German army, recognizing the principle's utility, began to emulate it in retreat, constructing what they called Bettenigel, concrete hedgehogs, along the Rhine bridges. War has no monopoly on irony. What once thwarted tigers became the Reich's last guardians against advancing Shermans. By then, the nickname "dumb bucket" had drifted into soldiers' parlance, far from its origin. It stood for any contraption cobbled from leftovers that nonetheless worked. Journalists visiting the front adopted it too, weaving moral subtext into their reports. One correspondent for the Daily Telegraph wrote in June 1944, "Perhaps the lesson of the dumb bucket is that cleverness needs no polish. The line circulated through Allied bulletins, an unofficial anthem for men whose ingenuity filled gaps left by supply shortages. Behind every bucket, however, lay the echo of those who conceived, built, and sometimes died beside them. Arthur Mendel did not survive the campaign. A mine exploded under the truck, carrying him toward Naples in late 1944. His notes were found in a satchel covered with dried cement and later archived in the Imperial War Museum. Harrow, by contrast, lived to see Berlin's surrender. He returned to civil engineering in Leeds, writing modestly about drainage systems, but never boasting of his wartime contraptions. When asked in a 1960 interview whether he thought those buckets mattered, he replied, paraphrased by the interviewer, "What mattered was that we refused to let fear be the engineer." Such words cast the device not merely as a clever trick, but as microcosm of a broader human pattern, the capacity to assign purpose to debris. Long before robotics or satellite targeting, the war in Europe had already proved that adaptation outweighs perfection. Whether in Tunisia's dust or Tona's rubble or Anzio's mud, men with little more than shovels and imagination bent the weight of industry back upon itself. Their defeat of the invincible tigers was, at heart, an act of material philosophy, that anything shaped by hand can also be reshaped by hand. As the summer of 1944 dawned and Allied columns prepared for the landings in France, those engineers again gathered their fragments. Barbed wire, spare rails, and old barrels waited to be reborn into barriers. Somewhere among them, perhaps, a few of Harrow's younger apprentices remembered the Tunisian dawn when a notebook recorded hope against armour. The question remained, suspended between memory and necessity. How many more dumb buckets would it take to turn the march of steel into a halt, even for a moment? It was in pursuit of that question, under the roar of engines advancing toward Normandy, that the next and most decisive chapter of the drums began. The landing craft touched the French shore before first light on the 6th June 1944. Mist blurred the coast, concealing movement yet smothering sound. For Lieutenant David Harrow, newly reassigned to an engineering detachment with the 79th Armoured Division, the invasion scale felt almost abstract. Fleets of machines beyond measure, men reduced to dots on the horizon. On his lap rested not a rifle, but a rolled blueprint marked Obstruction, Counter, Plan, Urban Advance. Inside the circled sketches was the latest refinement of his old dumb bucket concept. The war had crossed the Channel, so had the buckets. The geography of Normandy shaped every decision. Its villages, stitched between hedgerows and stone lanes, were too dense for armoured manoeuvre. After the initial beachhead, British and Canadian forces faced counterattacks of Tigers and Panthers, moving through narrow roads lined with ruined farm walls. Conventional anti-tank ditches were impossible to dig in time, and heavy guns often sank into soft, rain-churned soil. Harrow's orders reached him on 10 June, establish rapid obstacles along the approaches to Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives before dusk. The supply column promised steel rails the next morning, but the tanks could arrive at any hour. He turned to what he knew. "Concrete, barrels, nails, whatever keeps a tread awake," he told his men, paraphrased from a field log kept by a corporal. They gathered from barns and bombed workshops, milk churns, broken fence posts, fragments of masonry. Civilians joined under whispered consent. An elderly mason showed them how to mix quicklime from fallen walls. A farmer provided pig troughs to serve as moulds. In drizzling rain, the forms hardened unevenly, giving the finished block strange organic shapes, half bucket, half boulder. By night, the road glistened under lanterns shielded by coats. The air smelled of lime dust and wet straw. Harrow paced between set obstacles, noting they were not pretty but plentiful. At dawn, muffled engine noise approached from the east. The 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements advanced, a Tiger at the forefront. When it met the first row of hardened troughs, the tank slewed sideways, sliding into a pit carved by overnight rain. A second machine halted behind, its tracks grinding uselessly. Allied infantry poured fire into the confusion. Later inspection confirmed only one hull burned, yet the halt preserved the junction long enough for reinforcements to anchor a perimeter. That single episode repeated itself in variations across dozens of towns. German armour, purpose-built for open country, found itself trapped inside labyrinths of collapsed walls, market stalls, and improvised chicanes. Engineers adapted the drum in every form, sometimes filled with gravel, sometimes wired with small explosive charges to shatter treads. The pattern of use followed the terrain. In damp lowlands, the mixture expanded and cracked, so soldiers shifted to wooden boxes bound with wire and poured over with bitumen from local depots. Summer heat and thunderstorms complicated the work. Cement refused to set under continuous showers. Mud swallowed ropes and boots alike. "We carried the barrels as if through a grave," one sergeant remembered decades later, paraphrased from an oral history held at the Imperial War Museum. It was a fight with the earth before any enemy arrived. Advanced supply trains solved little. Tinned rations and empty fuel drums became part of the fortifications themselves. The irony, Harrow observed in a July 1944 letter to his sister, was painful. Every obstacle begins as a reminder of what we lack. As Allied forces pressed through Normandy into northern France, railway sabotage by resistance groups and summer congestion forced engineers to rely heavily on local resources. This shaped the second life of the dumb bucket, not merely British or Canadian, but collaborative. In Chartres, French partisans provided cartloads of debris from destroyed warehouses. American units studying these makeshift layouts adapted them into the M5 Quick Obstacle, a formalized version built with steel drums strapped to timber beams. But where bureaucracy demanded precision, field reality still deferred to improvisation. By late August, the liberation of Paris brought an urban theatre unlike any before. The boulevards were wide, ideal for tanks, but the narrow by-streets still favoured defenders. Harrow reached the outskirts 2 days before the uprising ended. His unit provided technical aid, though the fighting had largely subsided. He recorded impressions rather than triumph. "The city smells of gasoline, victory, and ghosts," he wrote in a notebook now preserved in a family collection. Yet even within the celebrations, engineering teams studied remnants of German defences and learned anew how commonplace objects could delay armoured giants. The Germans, now short of materials, had used their own crude blocks, filled with rubble, smeared with tar. The mirror image unsettled him. The seasons turned. Autumn 1944 carried the armies toward Belgium and the Netherlands. Landscape shifted from chalk to clay, towns to dike-lined fields. Rain fell almost daily. Swelling canals and flooding plains. Here, the bucket trick metamorphosed yet again. Concrete was heavy, transport slow. Instead, engineers layered barrels with water and sealed them using buoyancy to form floating barriers. The method first appeared along the Scheldt estuary, where German counterfire made conventional fortification impossible. Improvised pontoons chained together, called water hedgehogs in official jargon, served to block amphibious guns. Weather was both ally and enemy. When freezing temperatures arrived in December during the Ardennes offensive, mud stiffened into armour of its own. The Battle of the Bulge tested every resource. Allied logistics reeled under snow, fuel crises bit deep. Engineers chiselled through ice to set charges and obstacles. Harrow, now temporarily attached to American units near Liège, wrote a curt entry on 21st December. "The ground obeys no plan, it keeps what falls on it." His cynicism reflected fatigue more than defeat. A small photograph from the same week shows him standing by a pile of frozen sandbags streaked with sleet, expression unreadable. The so-called drum barricades regained relevance after Christmas 1944, when retreating Germans sent Tiger II tanks, even more massive than their predecessors, into small towns. Conventional mines often failed to detonate beneath their thick treads. Engineers returned to the basics: immobilize, not destroy. In the villages of Rochefort and La Roche-en-Ardenne, soldiers dug cellar floors and planted arrays of ice-covered crates, each filled with gravel. When a tank rolled onto them, the combined pressure collapsed the surface, creating localized depressions that trapped the machine. Historians later linked at least 4 captures to such makeshift pits. Behind these technical evolutions lay quieter human consequences. To civilians, every phase of construction meant noise, dust, and fear. Women and children carried lime sacks or rolled empty drums through alleys, uncertain whether they were preparing defenses or inviting counterfire. Yet participation gave dignity amid chaos. A Belgian widow recalled in a 1946 radio broadcast, paraphrased here, "We could not aim a gun, but we could roll a barrel. In that motion lived our courage." By early 1945, the German frontier loomed. In this final stage, the drum obstacle, humble means among mighty weapons, became almost ceremonial. As Harrow followed the Rhine crossings, he watched the once-honoured Tigers retreat, many already broken on roads littered with wreckage and snow. Engineers built single-line barriers more to control transport flow than to oppose armour. He described the landscape in one dispatch as both a junkyard and a river mouth, everything moving, nothing beautiful. The technological leap that had terrified him in Tunisia had been overtaken by another: air supremacy and endless ordnance. Yet his craft, the art of slowing the unstoppable, remained vital. The terrain beyond Remagen presented logistical nightmares: bridges half collapsed under bombardment, their banks slick with thawing frost. Units lacked heavy machinery and improvised again from industrial waste. Empty oil drums, remnants of Allied supply, served this time to reinforce causeways rather than block them. Men welded bars into crude lattices that doubled as road boundaries to prevent tanks from slipping off icy slopes. In each compromise, the war's circular logic reappeared. The same container that once halted machines now guided them forward. During a brief interval of rest at Koblenz in March 1945, Harrow reread his Tunisian notebooks, penciling margin comments about proportion and symmetry. The tone was no longer youthful improvisation, but weary analysis. He calculated load limits, plotted force vectors, converting experience into geometry. "One day, some student will find these equations dull," he wrote laconically, "and that will mean we have done our job." His reflection captured an invisible transition, the movement of engineering from urgency to remembrance. In parallel, abandoned German materials revealed striking similarity to Allied makeshift designs. Investigators catalogued rails welded into crosses, barrels packed with rubble, tangible confirmation that necessity recognized no side. A technical report issued in April 1945 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers concluded field expedient obstacles demonstrated moral as well as tactical effect. The apparent disorder imposed hesitation upon enemy crews. That hesitation, the split second between advance and doubt, had often decided encounters far more than precise aim. Through the thick of those months ran the constant presence of weather and fatigue. Snow melted into floods, soaking roadbeds and turning every crossing into a hazard. Supplies slowed, creativity accelerated. And the dumb bucket outlasted the winter, not as a single object, but as a principle: use whatever the moment provides. Among troops, tales spread half in jest that if one dropped a tin pail into any patch of mud, Lieutenant Harrow's spirit would appear to turn it into a barricade. When comrades teased him about the legend, he deflected with his typical dry humor. "Then make sure you drop it in the right direction." In April's thaw, Allied forces crossed into central Germany. The last resistances, pockets of armour sheltering in towns like Kassel and Brunswick, crumbled amid artillery thunder and smoke. Engineers dismantled earlier lines of barricades, clearing roads for civilians. Harrow supervised removal of many of his own contrivances. Watching bulldozers crush the once heroic drums, he confessed, in a final notebook note dated 10 of April, 1945, "Each bucket cost hours of fear. To erase them feels treacherous, but perhaps peace needs emptier roads." That evening, as the Rhine wind carried smoke eastward, he sat on a heap of cracked concrete, sketching a single line, a tank halted beside a barrel, both still, equal in silence. The war would soon close around that image. For men like him, who had shaped their survival from ruins, victory came with an odd melancholy. They had built masterpieces meant to fail gracefully. Within weeks, Germany surrendered. The tigers that once dominated imagination lay rusting in barns or sunken roads. Photographers documented rows of empty drums and broken hedgehogs, their purpose finished. Climate, terrain, and human labor had conspired against steel, and the most brilliant engineers of both armies stood equally puzzled by how simple hindrance had triumphed where advanced firepower faltered. The chapter of the dumb bucket had fulfilled its ironic destiny, a gesture of weakness that became a blueprint for resilience. Yet the story, even in ending, carried questions unmeasured by victory parades. For every field improvised, another street still bore scars of concrete and scorch. Civilians who had molded obstinate shapes from household debris now faced the quieter challenge of rebuilding dwellings from the same remnants. The engineers' ingenuity had saved them only by teaching destruction a different rhythm, slower, human, deliberate. As spring dawn spilled across ruined bridges and emptied depots, Harrow prepared his final report for the Corps of Engineers, submitting sketches and diaries he knew few would read. His last entry, dated 10 May 1945, read simply, "The barrels are gone, but the habit remains, to find structure in wreckage." It was both summary and confession, a bridge from noise to silence. The roads he once clogged were now cleared for peace convoys, yet along their verges pieces of cement and rusted wire caught the morning light like relics. Standing beside them, he sensed that memory would soon solidify as those blocks had once done, slowly, unevenly, but enduring. From the beaches of Normandy to the riverbanks of the Rhine, the improvised barriers had accomplished their temporary mission. What they left behind was no monument, only the quiet realization that creativity can outlast command. Even as the first reconstruction crews arrived and bulldozers sang where mortars once did, whispers of the engineer's craft lingered. A veteran passing through the cleared streets of Arnhem pointed to a surviving lump of concrete near a wall and murmured, "That little fool stopped a tiger." The phrase, half amusement, half awe, floated into history as epilogue to a long improvised war. And beyond the smouldering cities in the notebooks of men like David Harrow, the final pages waited, a place not yet filled, where the proof of invention would turn into reflection, where consequence would follow cause. It was there, at the edge of surrender, but not yet at peace, that the conclusive reckoning of the dumb bucket was about to begin. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the era of the tank had ostensibly triumphed in industrial terms, but humbled itself in human ones. The Allied advance, stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the Elbe, had cost millions of lives, soldiers, civilians and prisoners together. Precise counts vary. Military historians estimate that from June 1944 to May 1945, combined Allied armies lost roughly 760,000 in death and missing, the Axis in the Western theatres perhaps twice that number. Behind those statistics rested smaller stories of barricades built from dustbins and of men who carried more cement than hatred. Among destroyed towns and twisted metal lay the remnants of obstacles once scorned as foolish, which had nonetheless altered the tempo of entire campaigns. In the final military analyses compiled that autumn, engineers charted their lessons coldly. Improvised roadblocks and drum obstacles had no decisive influence on grand strategy, yet their repeated, localized successes taught commanders something machines alone could not reveal. Terrain and will are twin weapons. Against heavy armor, the decisive variable was not caliber, but imagination. Reports from the British 79th Armoured Division concluded field expedients, though temporary, multiplied defensive time by factors of hours or days, that margin which separates encirclement from survival. Facts align with this assessment. Each extra hour gained by engineers in Ortona, Anzio or Normandy allowed reinforcements to reposition, preventing collapses that might have prolonged the war. Beyond numbers, the moral weight of such ingenuity lingered in the soldiers' correspondence. Lieutenant David Harrow, whose final note closed the wartime narrative, returned to Leeds in late 1945 and resumed civilian engineering. When asked during a veterans conference in 1954 whether those so-called dumb buckets truly stopped the Tigers, he replied, a recollection recorded by BBC Radio, "Some of them did, most only slowed them, but they proved something. A barrel can be braver than its maker." The crowd laughed softly, uncertain where humour ended and grief began. The ethical resonance lay not in destruction, but in restraint. In military doctrine, ingenuity is amoral. It serves whichever flag employs it. Yet within these improvised defences there existed an impulse to counter organised violence without surrendering humanity's smaller virtues, resourcefulness, cooperation, daring born of limitation. Civilians who helped mould barrels or carry gravel were not soldiers, yet their labour blurred dividing lines. The war's end brought recognition that the boundary between resistance and survival is measured not by weaponry, but by effort. Even in their anonymity, these builders embodied a lesson long repeated, since technology may govern power, but creativity rescues meaning. On the political plane, the obstacles told another story, that modern warfare's progress also confesses its fear of simplicity. The Panzer Tiger, apex of armoured design, met defeat as often from terrain and scarcity as from anti-tank rounds. Allied analysts later inferred that industrial supremacy must not ignore environmental humility, the ability to adapt machines to human scale. The post-war generation of combat engineers built upon this paradox. Manuals of the 1950s institutionalized what had once been improvisation, field expedients, modular obstacles, rapid set concrete. Bureaucracy had absorbed inspiration, commandeering flexibility into formula. Yet the original spirit, men bending circumstance itself into defense, remained something no manual could fully codify. There was, too, a quieter reckoning about cost. Every block that halted a tank did so amid neighbouring ruins. Civilian casualties during the last campaigns of 1944-1945 in Western Europe are estimated at over 500,000, though sources diverge widely. To lay obstacles in one street often invited artillery upon the next. Such irony haunted engineers who had built shelters of delay, as one diary phrased it. "We bought time with someone else's roof," an Allied corporal wrote dispassionately in early 1945. Facts confirm the destruction. Interpretation requires gentler balance. No calculation can fully account for the lives spared by those delays, nor the homes they doomed in being effective. Environmentally, the dumb buckets belong to war's brief ecosystem of necessity. Cement hardened, metal rusted, weeds grew through cracks. Nature's slow verdict on invention. Yet the underlying principle survived peace. In post-war reconstruction, surplus drums and barrels served reverse purposes: frames for bridges, molds for foundations, even planters for memorial flowers. The reuse of the same materials symbolized a cyclical mercy, objects born for obstruction reborn for renewal. Municipal archives in Caen record a 1947 memo advising local councils to retain usable concrete from wartime defences for civic repair. Out of destruction, the grammar of rebuilding quietly emerged. Ethically, the episode raises durable questions about responsibility under constraint. Soldiers faced with overwhelming odds found virtue not in heroics but in craft. Their success challenged the assumption that victory depends solely on superior force. It suggested instead that moral endurance can consist in the refusal to disappear, even if one's weapon is only a filled bucket. Military philosophers later framed this as the logic of sufficiency, the notion that modest action correctly timed may surpass sophisticated preparation. What David Harrow and his comrades unwittingly articulated through their handiwork was a politics of humility, the belief that intellect serves best where material grandeur collapses. Some interpretations, naturally, romanticize this ingenuity as proof of national character or divine favor. Historical caution implies otherwise. Circumstance, not destiny, created the need. But within that pragmatic space of survival, ethics and intelligence intertwined. The improvised obstacle did not change ideology. It revealed durability within fragility, cooperation within confusion. It tells us more about the shared human condition than about the nations involved. When viewed 7 decades later under the calm of restored European streets, the memory of those so-called dumb buckets feels almost tender. Museums in Normandy and Turin display fragments of concrete drums beside rusted tank treads, symbols modest and self-contradictory. In one gallery, visitors hear a recording from a wartime broadcast, a British announcer paraphrasing a field report. The engineers, short of steel, have turned necessity into architecture. The line still stirs quiet amazement. Architecture, after all, implies permanence, while their creations were meant to crumble. Perhaps that very impermanence is the lesson. Anything devised under pressure acquires dignity not through duration, but through intention. In the end, the outcome of the dumb bucket experiment can be measured less by wrecked tigers than by altered minds. For veterans who return to civil engineering, public works, or simple farming, the memory became metaphor. They had learned that the same curiosity which defends life can rebuild it. For generals and politicians, the legacy translated differently, a reminder that doctrine grows from practice, not decree. War may forge technologies, but it is crises of material that forge societies. Today, as newer conflicts unfold with drones and digital precision, echoes of those primitive obstacles persist in principle, though not in shape. Each innovation engenders its equal opposite: improvisation rising to meet excess. The same question Arthur Mendel scribbled in Tunisia still hovers unaging in time. When power arrives in steel and tracks, what can human wit summon from scrap? The answer, glimpsed across decades, seems forever provisional. Whatever the next war or disaster may be, resourcefulness will always begin at ground level, in the hands of ordinary people rearranging what remains. Somewhere along the Normandy coast, remnants of buried drums occasionally surface after storms, worn concrete shells, edges rounded by tide. Children collect them without knowing their ancestry, sometimes painting flowers across the pitted grey. In that small gesture lies a reconciliation that no treaty could stipulate. Out of what once defied tanks, innocence fashions colour. There, beneath a calm sky, the war's mute artifacts complete their final duty, to stand silently as proof that intellect, compassion, and survival are never far apart. And as waves erase their outlines again, one might wonder, not in nostalgia, but in caution, whether in future storms of invention and destruction, humanity will remember the wisdom of a bucket filled with courage.